life professionally, my career was in juvenile justice. I stepped away from that work a little over 3 years ago for the department, but I think my role here today, talking to a couple people, is just kind of give a sense of the history. And so that's my hope, to contribute to that part of the information gathering and learning. So within that, just a few minutes I'll talk about today. You've got my written testimony, and you should have a handout too that's a colored thing from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention as well. But just a few highlights from that, if I may. In the first page of that, I kind of describe a little bit, the complexity of what is juvenile justice and child welfare. And the professionals who did this work are such people I think we should all admire as citizens of this state, that make their lives and their careers dedicated to this work. It is hard work. Then when you have these families and children who, if you will, intersect, or the term that's become of art in recent years is crossover youth, that work that's already hard is exponentially even more difficult to do what's right for that child or that youth, depending on their stage of life and what terminology is comfortable to each of us. And then when you insert, okay, there's been a crime committed, and often the data shows that crime is some call it affliction of adolescence. It's things that if we took a poll, and probably everybody in this room might have either known somebody who did as a teenager or did yourself. We're in Vegas, isn't it? We won't talk about that. My point just being, we can overreact to the very, very serious things. And please don't hear me differently. There are some very, very serious things that a young person can do in society. So we can't not think about that. We can't not have policies to prepare for that. We just should be very thoughtful in how we go about that. Also, my testimony, page 2, I go through some of the history. A lot of people think of Senate Bill 367 as like this thing, and it was a pretty large bill, 80-some-ish pages. I didn't look that up. But reform's been happening in Kansas in earnest since about 2010. And I list some of the organizations that's been involved in that work. And then on page 4, I list a number of resources if you have time, and I respect that you don't this time of year very much. But some resources, if it's helpful to you, go back and see some of the research that's the foundation for the juvenile justice system as the state of Kansas enacted it a few years ago, and then as it operates to this day in our state. From that, you also see in that testimony, we're getting at the macro level, if you will, we're getting results. We see that arrests are down over the last few years, 52%. We see that court filings are down almost 21%. We see incarcerated youth at the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex are down 44%. There's other facts that you could use. There's other facts to the contrary, and I put a little bit in that too, in my testimony too, if you see in there. There are a few kids, 16 in the most year of arrests, that have murdered another person, or that's the allegation they're before the courts for. It happens. We have to work with that population as well. There are 108, I think was the number in there, of kids who get arrested with a weapon. Very concerning public safety thing to all of us. So both ends of the spectrum do happen. Within that, and some of those resources, what I hope to leave you just understanding today is your Kansas juvenile justice system today the policies were enacted after a lot of thoughtful conversation based on research, based on data done by all of our predecessors. I think if I look, maybe 4 of you were in the legislature when this happened. So a lot to take in. But I would just leave you with that thought of a lot of thought went into this. They're based on fact, based on data, based on research. Does not mean we can't do better. Obviously, we can all do better. Juvenile justice system, child welfare system are always striving to make progress. And I think both systems continually are making progress. But we should never, in my view, take the lens that, hey, we've arrived. We've done everything. Another thought share, and this goes to the OJJDP document that I didn't think to include this weekend and thought of it this morning, so put it in there. If you look at the top left box of all the nice little graphics there, I think the most important thing for us to understand is what we are doing in Kansas and have done in Kansas is really the national norm. We're not outside doing something differently. That statistic is from 2020, or from 2000 to 2020. Nationally, the use of secure and unsecured incarceration for juvenile offenders is down 77% in the United States. Everybody's doing this because we know the research tells us we needed to change our systems. We needed to stop incarcerating kids for lower end acts. We need to stop incarcerating them for long periods of time, because there's some good body of research that says more time really doesn't change the behavior. And while doing that, we are getting safer and we're saving taxpayer resources. So I'll close with a couple thoughts and then, of course, take questions, Madam Chair, if that's the plan. As I think back on this work and looked at this work across time, I remember early in my career when Kansas had another version of reform that happened in about 95 to 1997, where we shifted from a child welfare model to a very much like an adult model. And I remember some folks that are older and wiser, because I was pretty young then, who said, when you have a major systemic change, you're probably going to have a third of your people are early adopters. I'm on board. This makes sense to me. You have another third that they may get there eventually, and a third who may never buy into the policies. So I think that's important context as we get feedback. As I would ask of you, please ask people to bring data and facts and research. Maybe we do need to make some improvements and modifications, but let's do it based on that, not just what we see in the paper or a few exceptional cases. With that, I'll just close with, as I hope always has been the experience for the Corrections Committee and would be for those of you in child welfare, the Kansas Department of Corrections, our resources, our people, our staff are here to be a collaborative partner and be of an assistance when and where we can. With that, Madam Chair, I hope that was the right amount of time.
Good for me. Good job. I think we'll hold questions till
very good.
All the conferees.
Okay.
Okay, next up, we'll hear from Christina Smith, who is a parent, and she's joining us via WebEx.
On September 3rd, while recovering from ACL surgery, my oldest son threatened to kill me if I sent him back to the psychiatric residential treatment. After aggressively shoving me up against the wall, I tried to call 911 for assistance. When he saw what I was doing, he grabbed my phone and threw it as hard as he could across the room where it went through the wall. I was 4 days post-op on crutches, non-weight bearing, and my surgery knee was locked in extension. For my safety, I went from our living room to my bedroom. My 15-year-old, who is 6'1" and 160 pounds, pushed past my 70-year-old mother to willfully and brutally attack me after he yelled that if I was going to report him for assault, he would show me assault. I want to thank the people here today for taking time to listen to my voice. My name is Christina Smith. I am a single mom, a nurse, and a full-time student. Daily, I live with multiple autoimmunes that contribute to me being physically disabled. My life revolves around my 3 boys. We have lived in Sedgwick County since 2014. With dedication, I have fought every day to make a better life for my sons, making sure they receive every service they qualify for in Sedgwick County. The last 4 years, I have unknowingly and directly been impacted by Bill 367 that was passed into law in 2016. These years have been a path of terror. Bill 367 allows grace for juveniles that make mistakes, but the law has put me in danger more times than I can count. This last year, my oldest son was empowered by the lack of consequences for his ever increasingly violent behavior due to this leniency. We tried every service, from therapy, mental health services, medication, and the SED waiver. Despite all of this, he had multiple acute and 1 long-term psychiatric hospitalization. Still, my child's behavior continued on a trajectory path of violence, putting my family's safety at risk. The DA continuously chose not to press charges because they said that there was no substantial evidence of continued behavior. What the DA didn't know was even though I called the police many times for assistance and for everyone's safety, my son would threaten to do worse harm if he was ever booked into JAG. My family's life was filled with insults, put downs, foul language, and threats to be harmed or killed. Bill 367 ensures that juveniles, unless they are involved in a violent crime, are never actually charged and never convicted. No real consequences happen. The situation escalates until the system has no other options. Leaving the violent child offender in the same environment does not make things better. Placing the violent child offender into foster care system alongside children that lack parents is misguided. Foster care should be reserved for children in need of care. Sink kids are those who have been abused or neglected, which does not describe my oldest son at all. A minimum of 4 charges of battery were filed against my son in the last year. All charges were dropped because of Bill 367. Our lies consisted of him threatening to turn me in for abuse on a daily basis, holding DCF as leverage. He was empowered to continue to hurt us since DCF only acted on his behalf without regard to my safety as a single physically disabled parent. I had no voice, scared, alone, with no help from those who were sworn to protect and serve. Within my family, Bill 367 protected the very person who sought to harm me and my youngest 2 children. His increasingly violent behavior became brutal after I had had surgery. Nonetheless, because of Bill 367, he is free of any accountability. As a parent, I was forced to choose between 2 options: to be battered or possibly killed, or to refuse to bring my son home after getting him psychiatric help. On September 28th, my son was released from St. Joseph Mental Health Hospital, but for the life and safety of my youngest 2 children and for myself, I refused to pick him up. I paid the consequences for his willful choices when I was charged with child abandonment by the Wichita PD, and my violent son was placed in foster care. My son's charges for his violent attack and threats to kill me on September 3rd included assault, battery, and criminal property damages. These charges were dropped by the DA on November 8th. And I think this is because Bill 367 removed the DA's options. How many people like me have to choose between life-threatening violence in the home or with being charged with child abandonment, which then threatens them with losing their other children? What are we teaching juveniles in Sedgwick County? Willfully violent juveniles are being empowered by the lack of consequences for their actions. In the last year, Bill 367 has caused my family not only to lose our home, but subjected us to constant attacks, severe financial strain, and stripped us of our right to safety and protection. My name is Christina Smith. I am a mother with a deep love for her 3 sons. I am not just a survivor, but a thriver who not only believes in grace, but for accountability. Please put common sense back into the law. Thank you for hearing my voice today.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks for sharing your message. Next up, we have Gina Meyer Hummel with O'Connell Children's Shelter. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for having me here today. Wow, I don't even know if I can do justice after that. So I appreciate the comments. I'm going to go off script a little bit. You have my testimony. O'Connell Children's Shelter is a residential program that has existed in Kansas for over 46 years. We are a YRC2. We offer QRTP services, and I'll go into the history a little bit in a second. But I wanted to give you a sense of what we're talking about. I've been around the Kansas child welfare system before we privatized child welfare in Kansas. I've been doing this work for 30 years. And I've been involved with some of the initiatives that Randy spoke of, and Randy and I go way back. So I'm going to dispute a little bit of what Randy said, in that we may have had some really great results on the juvenile justice side, macro level. But I'm telling you that the impact to our child welfare system is major, and we didn't plan for it. And that's the part that's most troublesome. We established a bill, we made changes, it impacted our child welfare system, it impacted the youth that we're called to serve, that we're called to protect, and we didn't prepare for it. And then we wondered why our child welfare providers were struggling. So this is all our doing, our collective doing. So it has had an impact, and it's not an insufficient impact, as you might recall. I wanted to also I picked out every day O'Connell gets referrals from all of the child welfare providers to look at who we can take into our facility. So upwards of 80 young people we get referred to us every day who are needing placement in a facility such as ours. And those same referrals go out to other providers across the state. So I just picked one. I just picked the first ones I saw today. And I want to give you some sense of who we're getting referrals on, just because I think you hear that, but I want you to hear some of the behaviors, because I think it's so striking. There's a juvenile justice system, and there's a child welfare system that was created a long time ago with good reason. This is wonderful. I'm obviously not going to talk about names and specifics. This is a young person, 16 years old, who the reason he's being referred for a placement today is because he doesn't feel safe in his current placement. The other young people in his placement steal his belongings, pressure him to do drugs, beat him up, bully him. He feels unsafe and like he's going to kill himself. That's the result of mixing populations without adequate controls in place. You can go on to read this young man's referral. He has a learning disability. He's been suspended for fighting in school. He's been kicked out of multiple schools. He's verbally and physically aggressive. So it goes on and on. He's defiant. I can't tell from this if now he's a victim or a perpetrator. But what I know is that he's scared and he needs services, and that he's not being protected by the system that was set up to protect him, and that he's not being served, quite frankly, very well, because he's on a referral list and he needs placement. So we're trying to find him a placement. Don't have a placement for him today. So who knows where he ended up? I don't know if he ended up in an office. I don't know if he ended up in a one-night stay. He has self-harming behavior. He has suicide ideation, threatens to kill himself. That's one. Very first one I pulled. Let me give you another just example. These are young people who are needing placement, and you're wondering why we can't find foster families. You're wondering why we can't keep child welfare staff. These are what we're asking folks to do. So, confirmed gang violence, physical damage to property, verbal aggression, physical aggression, defiance, incarcerated for the past 30 months. The referral goes on to say, we don't know what to expect when he comes out. Do you want to take him? Should we place him with other child in need of care? Should we just take him and put him in our facility without knowing exactly what it is we're getting ourselves into? You go on, and it talks about police intervention due to his dysregulation, mental health issues, self-harming, suicide ideation. Again, I only give you that. Those are the first two I pulled. There were 80 more just like it. So this is the real stuff that we're faced with. We want to help kids. We exist to help young people. But when we put young people in a system built to protect kids and help reintegrate kids with their families. And then we don't empower that system to take care and give them tools they need. We end up with a system much like we have today that's not serving anybody very well, quite frankly. So real issues that we need to solve. And so that's why I'm here today. O'Connell Children's Shelter has been in existence, like I said, for 46 years. Mrs. O'Connell, interesting enough, Mrs. O'Connell gave the 120 acres outside of Lawrence to us because she cared about kids. She was seeing our young people incarcerated, our young men incarcerated, and she knew the impact that was going to have to families, the long-term impact. Nobody's saying that we want young people incarcerated. We want the tools we need to be able to serve them adequately. That's what we're asking for. I think you're going to hear that over and over. Is we need the system to be able to help us help kids. O'Connell recently merged with the Children's Shelter. The Children's Shelter has existed in our community to do police protective placement. So that basically means we do emergency placement. So O'Connell took long-term kids who were struggling, who were facing incarceration, and the Children's Shelter took emergency placements. And so we merged 2 years ago after COVID, when all agencies were struggling, trying to figure out how we were going to take care of kids. We now offer a full continuum of services, and I'm really blessed to be able to do the work. But I want you to know that it's not without, it's a struggle. It's a struggle every day. We look at who we can adequately serve. We do not take in our facility young people who we can't manage. So there are a lot of young people who we would love to serve, but we turn away because we don't want to add trauma to their trauma already. We don't want to add to their disruption. Every child referred to us has had multiple placements. Many of them have had their rights terminated. Many of them spend their holidays alone in our facilities. Many of them will exit our system if it weren't for us or the system trying to adequately prepare to homelessness. So the pipeline from foster care to prison to homelessness is real. And we've got to do something different to help these young people. O'Connell, many years ago, started a bridging program. We noticed that we were doing a great job. Again, we only admit kids we know we can take care of. We were doing a great job of stabilizing kids. And we were really worried about what are we going to do. No, it's not great if we stabilize them and then all of a sudden they transition out to homelessness. Well, what good have we done then? So we started a bridging program all on our own. No money from the state. It's all privately funded. In that process, we fund, Bible studies, faith development. We teach the kids how to agriculture. We teach the kids about employment. We get them jobs, real jobs. We work with partners. We had a young man go to work for KU. We had another young man go to work for the pretzel company in town. So we work to get real jobs, to get real skills for our young people so that they're really connected. We also put coaches around them. We want them to have adequate supports when they leave us, and we make sure that they have adequate housing when they leave us. So I want you to know, though, that despite taking the kids we screen, we only take kids that we think we can serve. We've had lots of incidents happen. We had a couple of staff attacked. We've had several unfortunate incidents where young people commit crimes on other young people in our facility. We have cameras in our facility. We wand kids when they walk in the door. We have people up all night doing 15-minute checks. And this still happens in our facility. So this is not like we're not monitoring what's going on, and crimes against other kids are still happening. So we have got to do something about taking care of the young people who are having delinquent behavior and make sure we have adequate resources and that we give judges and the DAs adequate tools so that if they are committing crimes or if families are struggling, that there are options for them. I put my recommendations at the back. I'm happy to answer questions. Like I said, O'Connell We would love to be an answer for all these kids. We think we need to do more community prevention. We think we need smaller child welfare contracts so caseloads can be more manageable. We want kids to have same-day treatment. We want to expand, obviously, social service personnel. We want to continue to invest in direct child welfare workforce. Thank you, by the way, for your investment last year. We're a small nonprofit. We've never had staff who got a $2,000 bonus before. That was unheard of. So thank you for that. That was amazing. Senate Bill 367 needs to allow for some kind of detention and some kind of short-term incarceration when it's needed, mainly so we can get a plan in place so that the court can have options. I'm happy to stand for questions. I think you get the point. You hear it over and over again. All of us are here because we care about kids. All of us are here wanting to help kids, help us do our job. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Okay, next up, we're going to hear from Mark Bennett via WebEx.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for allowing me to do this by WebEx. Saves me about 4 or 5 hours on the road, and I'm sure I've got other things I need to attend to this afternoon. I've submitted written testimony, just a general overview of 367. A couple of things I'd point out in terms of the history for those of you who weren't around in 2016. Fundamentally, there were two overarching principles, I think, which advised and impacted the way the bill was passed ultimately. One is the notion that was held then that incarceration is an objectively harmful thing for juveniles. And while I understand that logic, I disagreed then and disagree now with the follow-up to that, which is that there's a direct causal connection. One night in detention is directly the most prime predictor of future incarceration. I get that, and I'm sure that that is a final link in the chain, but it ignores all the other societal issues going on in the home with the kid, peer pressure, all sorts of other things, criminal history, etc. But that was accepted at the time as a viable position. Number two, akin to that and related to that, was the notion then that child needed care system would be a better placement for many youth. I've listed, the issues that I think that I hear from prosecutors in terms of our concerns. In my written testimony, tried to boil them down. You could go back and look at the dozens of pages that I wrote in 2016, asking, first of all, in opposition, also making suggestions to how the bill could be rolled out differently, well documented my concerns. I guess to try to summarize this in a reasonable amount of time, I'll say this. The low-level offenders, misdemeanants, kids who have stolen property, used drugs, with the marijuana, shoplift, kids who get in fistfights, nobody gets hurt, but those sorts of things. The system then and the system now probably does a fairly adequate job of addressing those. Those are kids who probably don't need to spend the night in an incarcerated setting. They can go home. They do have a support system in place that will help redirect their behavior and hopefully lead to change and lead them not to be back in the system. And on the other end of the extreme, we have kids who shoot people and kill them and commit forcible sexual offenses. And frankly, the system has never been particularly good at dealing with those kids. And frequently, with increasing frequency now because of 367, those kids end up in the adult system. And so as a result, numbers are down because we're sending a lot more kids to the adult system. I don't know that that was the ultimate goal, but that's the takeaway. The question and the concern here really is the middle group of kids, the ones who done something more than what I think we would consider normal bad behavior on the part of juveniles. This isn't just a kid who smoked a joint or pushed somebody around or made some verbal threats without thinking it through. We're talking about kids with guns, kids who've maybe done a drive-by, but nobody was injured. They managed not to hit anybody. They've done criminal threats where there's repeated acts of threats of violence. And the one that I hear the most and have the most concern for, frankly, is what I would just generally refer to as family violence. Kids who direct their anger, their violence, maybe not profoundly violent, nobody's going to the hospital, but pushing and shoving and threatening and making life miserable is directed at their family members, younger siblings, parents, etc. For those folks, the options are very few. We can charge a misdemeanor battery and bring them in the system. There's a 45-day length total on detention. If we take the kid out and put him in detention for, say, even 2-3 weeks, while the case is pending, 2-3 weeks, maybe while the case is between adjudication and plea and sentencing, very quickly, the case, once we hit 45 days, cases has to be dismissed. It's done. And if the kid figures that out, before they can ever get into probation or get anything accomplished, the case is dismissed. We also have case length limits, which cap how long someone can be placed on probation. The whole idea of probation is to try to alter behavior through steps taken by the folks in the various probation departments. And again, that limits their options. Again, I put all this in the written testimony. But again, the really harmful ones are the ones that we see time and time again now, where we've got an individual who I happen to know who's called me. His son is out of control. Whether or not there's a mental health issue, I don't know. But when they try to take him to the various mental health institutions that are available in this jurisdiction for juveniles, the kid is smart and he knows what to say and knows how to tell them that he's not going to hurt himself or anyone else. So he's not a threat to himself or others under Chapter 59, and he's not so profoundly in the depths of a mental health crisis that he's unable to control his behavior or his temper. He can do all that. And the minute he gets home, he laughs at his parents and shoves them around and threatens them and refuses to go to school, refuses to do anything. And the parents are at an impasse, and they've called me. And when they can call the DA, personal friends who call the DA of Sedgwick County, I'm responsible for about a 20 to 25% footprint for the entire criminal justice system statewide. And my answer to them is, I have no answers. That's a unpleasant place for me, and it's certainly an unpleasant place for those folks to be in. So while I agree that the numbers are way down since the passage of 367, I think that was baked into it, and it has done a great job of helping the kids who need very little contact with the system, and we've simply offloaded the kids who are really, really dangerous into the adult system. The harder nut to crack, the more difficult ones are this middle range of groups of kids who are increasingly violent. We have a kid who was out on home placement. He brought a gun to a movie theater. Didn't shoot anybody, but brought it. Has been charged, but that's not enough for direct placement, so he's sent home. He waves a gun at some people, may have shot at them. They're not particularly cooperative. Nobody was hit though. So again, even though we've charged an ag assault, it's not something that's going to get him sent out of the home. And now on the third event in the last, 6 months or so, he shot and killed somebody this weekend. Probably an accidental discharge, but another young person lost his life. I'm not suggesting that young man should have been locked up, but I don't think the system we have in place right now certainly did him much good, or his friend who lost his life. So my suggestions are trying to be more concrete than just raising complaints here. As it will come as no surprise to anybody who's paid any attention to the criminal justice system across the state for the last several years, one thing we need is more access to mental health treatment, behavioral health treatment for adults and for juveniles. And so when we have people who are in a position where they're in some degree of mental health crisis or losing their grasp on reality, then we need to have a system in place, a robust system in place that allows treatment, and not just something where they go for a couple of days until they're stabilized and we send them back home. Number two, we need more options. This bill, when it was passed, the promise was it'd be $20 million. That was the price tag given, $20 million. That would be saved by shutting down all these other programs that existed pre-367, and those cost savings would be reintroduced into the local communities. That was the promise of the bill. And while I understand there's been some reinvestment, I don't think it's been anywhere to the tune, or to certainly what the legislators who sat in your chairs 6 years ago understood would be the case. And we need more investment in local programs, not the least of which would be respite type programs, places for, when a family comes in and says, I have a child who is out of control, has either sexually or physically assaulted younger siblings, has physically assaulted parents. And our answer is we try to keep families together. You need to take that child home. There needs to at least be something other than child in need of care, other than sending them to a foster care to burden an already burdened to capacity child in need of care system. Sending that kid to a foster parent who's already trying to help kids who have been sexually and physically abused and neglected strikes me as a recipe for disaster. And I think it's been shown to be the case over the last 6 years. So we need something more than just saying the answer to the alternative, the only alternative to incarceration for this middle group of kids is either send them home or send them to foster care. We need a third rail option, and I think it's local programs that would be supported on a far more robust manner than has been the case thus far. Those are my two primary goals for this group. I thank you for your time and giving you a very quick overview of the system. I know there have been other jurisdictions who started this program 6 years ago who have at this point given up on it and completely overturned their version of 367. A couple of states I understand have done that. I'm not suggesting that we do that. That ship sailed. We made a commitment to this as a state, and the infrastructure that had been in place in, say, 2015, I don't believe largely there anymore. And so rather than asking for you to undo what was done 6 years ago, I ask you to look for ways to more fully fund and fully support the efforts that are needed to address these kids who are on the increasing, on the uptick in violence and/or who direct their violence back to the people who are supposed to be their caregivers. Those are the folks who are at this point at the most risk. So I appreciate your time. And again, I'll stand for questions. I understand that'll take place at the end.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us. Next up, we have Remington Dalkey, Rice County Attorney by WebEx.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Remington Dalkey, and I'm the Rice County Attorney, and I have provided this written testimony, but I'm going to read through this and maybe go ad-lib towards the end. But I was appointed as a Rice County Attorney in 2018, and then I was elected in 2020. I was asked to speak on the implementation of Senate Bill 367 and its impact on the foster care system. Before I talk about that directly, I do want to say that I love the people that I work with in juvenile services. They are great people. They do a good job, but they do it with what they have. They are lacking what they need for the problems that we're seeing. Mr. Bennett said, and as I understand, Senate Bill 367 had a primary purpose to reinvest money gained from shutting down detention and residential facilities and diverting it instead into community supervision and treatment. And here in Rice County, located in between Great Bend and Hutchinson, we don't have sufficient community supervision and treatment options. When a juvenile offender is convicted and they aren't scored into a detention facility, they're placed on probation, where here they spend an hour a week at most reporting to a probation officer over Zoom who is located in Great Bend, and that's self-reporting how they're doing. They get on there for an hour at most and say, hey, life is great for me. I'm obeying everything I'm supposed to. I was in for curfew. I went to school today. And the probation officer has limited resources to check on that. I note here that the end result is that I've got kids who are caught vaping getting the exact same treatment as my kid who at the age of 16 showed up drunk at the pool, threw a beer can at a girl, threatened to kill her, was taken by law enforcement home to his parents. He woke up in the middle of the night, still drunk, broke into his neighbor's house and assaulted her when she was getting up to get a drink of water. And I would agree with what Mr. Bennett said, and Christina Smith, her story is very similar to what I'm hearing from the parents around here, is that we've got kids that are out of control. I had a JF, a 17-year-old female she started with a truancy case in 2018. She then had a battery in 2019. She thought some schoolgirl had made fun of her, so she drove up, jumped out of her car, beat the crud out of her, and then went back to school. She was placed on probation for that. But again, it was reporting once a week on Zoom saying she felt sorry for what she did. And that was the end of that. In 2020, she had another truancy case. And then in 2021, she had another similar battery where she's beaten some kids up at school. While her truancy case was open, I tried to get her placed into foster care. And I did that because I knew, based on her first misdemeanor battery, that she wasn't going to take this seriously. I could get another conviction for a misdemeanor battery and nothing different was going to change. So I amended her truancy case. I include allegations that she was without adequate parental care and control, which would allow us to remove her from the home. The parents agreed with that. They came to court and they said, they stipulated, said, yes, she is without adequate parental care and control. We can't control her. But the guardian ad litem was looking at the law and said, no, this girl is a truant and she's a juvenile offender, but she's not a child in need of care. So while we were waiting to have an evidentiary hearing on this, the girl drove to Hutch. She got a gun from somewhere and then shot her friend in the leg. I've also had a DG, a 17-year-old who was out drinking, smoking, racing, fighting, just a kid who did whatever he wanted. His parents had no control over him, and his parents actually encouraged him. I had filed multiple JV cases on him. I had him placed on probation numerous times. He was never removed from the home and did this self-reporting. At one point, our probation officer from Great Bend made the drive of 30 minutes to drive over here to check to see if he was honoring his curfew. When she knocked on his mom's door, mom said he's quarantined with dad. So she drove by dad's house. Dad says he's with mom. Turns out he was just out doing whatever he wanted to. I think that might be when he picked up a driving with an open container, driving. I don't know if there's a firearm in the gun or not. But he was out, and both parents knew this, and they were both lying on his behalf. And so throughout his probation, he continued doing whatever he wanted while bragging at school because he didn't fear any of the consequences. And he knew that the home where we kept placing him allowed him to do whatever he wanted to. So I filed a scene case on him saying that the parents were, that this child lacked the adequate parental care and control necessary for his well-being. We removed him from the home, and that really got a reaction from all of them. They showed up to court. They were all in tears saying that they would never allow anything like this to happen again. Please send him home. He shouldn't be out of the home. And so by having that option available, we were able to see at least some reaction to consequences. So with the limited options from Senate Bill 367, and I'll just say here that I definitely don't have nearly as much experience as Mr. Bennett. I was not a part of the juvenile system, at least in this role, prior to 2016. And so all I know is Senate Bill 367. But with what I've seen, I've got these kids shooting other kids. I've got parents that are encouraging behavior or are scared of their children. And so I do file scene cases instead of juvenile offenders. If I see a case come in and I see that the home is not going to be the proper place for him, if dad is not in the picture and mom is working 3 jobs, and so when we place him home, we're placing him back in a situation with absolutely no supervision, or if mom is scared of the child, I'll file a scene case in order to get this kid some services. Now, I think Ms. Smith earlier said that putting these kids in foster care placement is misguided, and I would agree with her completely. It is misguided, but from my position, it's about the only thing that I can do. It's the only option that I have. If I don't do something like this, I'm just going to have continued repeat behavior and escalating behavior. And so I do make the misguided decision to file these as scene kids, ask that they be removed from the home, so that way I know at least someone has got some eyes on them. Someone is trying to get them to some of their treatment. If they've got a drug and alcohol problem, trying to get them to treatment, or if they got mental health issues, I've got someone at least who's being paid to attempt to drive them to a mental health evaluation and treatment. And so, yes, I do file scene cases instead of JV cases, misguided or not. I feel like Senate Bill 367 has tied my hands, though. Again, I can't speak to how things were before Senate Bill 367. One last note, there was at the beginning someone saying that filings are down, and I would agree with that just because of my 20 to 25 scene cases here in Rice County. I would say 3 or 4 of them, so 12 to 20% are parents who are refusing to take their kids home because they're scared of them. So I've got these juvenile offenders that are going scene cases, so I'm filing less JV cases and more scene cases. So thank you for your time, and I will also hang around for questions if there are any.
All right, thank you. Thanks for joining us. Next up, I have Randy Kallstrom from Wyandotte Behavioral Health Network. welcome to our committees.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I believe you do have my testimony in front of you, so I'm just going to hit the highlights, maybe help you make up some time. I've been around the community mental health system for a long time, served in a variety of roles. Last 8 years, CEO of Wind Up Behavioral Health Network. I also had the opportunity to serve on the Judicial Review Committee in 2017 and the Crossover Task Force, both of which were examining SB 367 post 2016. The intent was very good, I believe. However, there was a lot of unintended consequences, which you've already heard, much of which is true in my experience. And I'll go back to the Judicial Review Committee that looked at this extensively in 2017. And the recommendations from that final report included crisis intervention and crisis intervention centers for juvenile offenders, a single point of access to treatment through the community mental health center system, addressing capacity issues in psychiatric residential treatment facilities, or PRTFs, and collaboration across systems. And those changes and enhancements are still very much in need almost 6 years later. The unintended consequences, as you've already heard, is a lot of, and I like how Mr. Bennett put it, those youth that were in the middle, not the really low level, kids acting out or these very severe felonies. But it basically eliminated group homes for those individuals that fell into the middle. Detention is not appropriate for those folks. I've been part of disproportionate minority work in Wyandotte County, and it identifies that there were an overabundance of youth being held in detention for extended periods of time, not a night, but extended periods of time. And the outcomes were never very good for those individuals. But the problem, as you've already heard again, is that there were not alternatives put into place to the level needed following Senate Bill 367, and including the community-based programs. As Ms. Gina testified, Wyandotte also provides emergency shelter work for juveniles who are brought into police protective custody, where we might have a 6-year-old who was placed into custody because of sexual or physical abuse, and then we have a referral for a 16-year-old who was brought into care as a child in need of care because the parent refused to pick them up. Very different children, very different needs, all being thrown into the same system. From a mental health provider perspective, there are programs, national models with evidence-based programming behind them. Two of the most common ones nationally are functional family therapy and multi-systemic therapy, FFT or MST. And while a few of these programs were implemented post Senate Bill 367, not nearly to the extent necessary. I recall a RFP that was sent out, but it was for a handful of therapists to cover multiple counties across the state. To the extent that we did not apply, and I don't believe any of the community mental health centers even applied to become a functional family therapy program, because the belief was we can't fulfill that. We can't provide adequate services. Both FFT and MST are very intensive programs that, by the model, are designed to serve really the most severe juvenile offenders with very serious juvenile offenses. It's a very intensive program that is designed for 5 hours a week or more, much of which is working alone with the parents and without the child present. We operated an MST program in Wyandotte County for 3 or 4 years. One of the challenges that we had with that program is that when we looked at the data and working with our community corrections in Wyandotte County, it was those kids in the middle, not the most severe, not those kids that were getting into fist fights, but they didn't qualify for the MST program because they didn't fit the matrix. So they were not even eligible for the MST program. The Juvenile Correction Advisory Board in Wyandotte County used to be funded for prevention services. And we had a program that we called Project Redirect that was based on the principles of MST, but was designed for a more early intervention. And it was, in fact, working with those youth and those families that were in the middle. The outcomes were good. We saw fewer charges, we saw fewer home disruptions, but it was very intensive work. Unfortunately, when funding to the JCABs were cut and an emphasis was placed on post-adjudicated youth, a lot of the prevention money just went away and that program was cut. Mental health centers can offer a variety of mental health programs that these youth we're talking about today might be eligible for, but not everyone. Our most intensive community-based services the child has to meet the criteria of having a severe emotional disorder. Some of the youth we're talking about today might meet that, but others will not, because it's really based on a whole host of issues, their mental health diagnosis, and their ability to function in homeschool and in the community. So some won't even be eligible based upon that. Another challenge with that is that until this past year, community mental health centers under the Medicaid program were not able to work with a parent alone without the child present. I think that has been corrected, but that's not even a year old at this time. Another challenge with mental health services serving some of these youth is the intensity of services that are required. Under a fee-for-service system, the managed care organizations will flag and then commit complete audits when they recognize someone as an outlier. So if they see some kids or some clients receiving more services compared to the typical or average client, it can trigger an audit. And it's a disincentive for us as a community mental health center to provide the level of care that might be needed. We might do it, but then we might go through, reams of documentation that we have to submit to the managed care organizations and put ourselves at risk of recoupment. Unfortunately, the only out-of-home placement available for the youth we're talking about today are the psychiatric residential treatment facilities, or PRTFs. Wyandotte County used to have a group home. It was operated by an organization called Associated Youth Services. Again, that program and that organization was disbanded after Senate Bill 367, but it was specifically designed for juvenile offenders and these crossover youth that we're talking about today. PRTFs are really designed for kids with mental health needs, not severe behaviors, not severe juvenile offenders, but kids with severe mental health needs who need a little bit longer stay in a residential program than 3 to 7 days in an inpatient mental health facility. They're not designed for these youth. Too often what we see is that the youth that we are referring for PRTF are not admitted or declined admission because of their history of aggression. And not that I blame the PRTFs. They're being asked to do an impossible job. So in closing, I really hark back to the recommendations from the Judicial Review Committee in 2017. Programs for early identification, a seamless system of referrals for these youth into appropriate community-based care, the development and proper funding for community-based programs such as FFT and MST. We know these programs can work. The research shows that they can work. But there also needs to be alternative out-of-home placements for those juveniles who really do need that level of care. But it has to be designed for their needs, not for the needs of the multitude of needs that children of all ages have. And very importantly, when a youth goes into an out-of-home placement, there needs to be work continuing with the family to help them prepare for that youth's return back into the home. And I will conclude my testimony at this time, and we'll be here for questions later.
All right, thanks, Randy. Okay, The next up is Crystal Hedrick, and while she's coming up with Foster Adopt Connect, the next 5 are all providers that we contract with. And if I could get you to limit to 5 minutes, and we've got a timer going here, then maybe we'll have a little bit of time left for some questions. Thanks. Welcome, Crystal.
Thank you for having me here today. My name is Crystal Hedrick. I'm the Vice President of Kansas Programs with Foster Adopt Connect. I've been a social worker here in Kansas since 2006. And I think, oh gosh, that was the 2000s. It really wasn't that long ago. But then I started adding it up. I'm like, oh wow, that's 17 years in child welfare years, which is something like dog years, I think. But I've had a variety of child welfare positions, practicum student, case manager, supervisor, director. A few years ago, 3 years ago, I stepped away from that direct work with the CMPs, and typically drafting testimony comes relatively easy to me, but this one has been a challenge to me. As I've sat here today and I'm sort of reliving my last few years providing that direct work. And if you see the red coming up on my neck, it's that I am reliving some of those experiences, and I know some of the people behind me are as well. In addition to my work in child welfare, I've also been a foster parent and adopted from foster care. During my time as a foster parent, my family chose to take placement of a sibling group of 3 kids, 15, 12, and 2. And they were in foster care to no fault of their own. Their parents had some challenges and their home conditions weren't what they should have been. And so when DCF and law enforcement went to that home to remove those kids, the 15-year-old, he was posturing. He was scared, and he took a pocket knife out of his pocket and he threw it at a tree nearby the DCF social worker. And that was really alarming. And when my family said, we'll take placement of all 3 of these kids, the workers kind of cocked an eyebrow and said, are you sure about that? But we felt really strongly that our training as foster parents and as a social worker, that we were prepared to help him. He was a kid that was scared. He was scared and he was angry, and it's a scary thing being moved from your family's home. And we felt like we could help him develop some healthier coping skills and work through some of that anger. That's a really, really different scenario than some of these other stories that I'm about to share with you. So fast forward a year, I was working in Southeast Kansas as director, helping support staff through best practice, monitoring outcomes, hiring, that kind of thing. I got a call one day that the Parsons Police Department was at our office, and they were concerned because one of the children that we were serving, she and her mom had murdered someone in the community. And through the investigation of that, she was detained. But through the investigation, they found that she and her mom had a very specific plan to also do the same with one of our case managers. And so on that day, I had to do something that I really had never, ever expected as a leader. And I had to figure out who I was going to reassign that case to. And as a leader, I always vowed that I would never ask my team to do something that I myself wouldn't do. And that was the first time, as a result of this Senate bill, that I had to do some of that. Another year passes, another year, 18 months passes, and I was the director of adoption services right here in Topeka. And I was in my office when a peer came in and said, I need your help. I was like, okay. And she said to me, there's a kid downstairs that has a gun in his hoodie, and I need you to either sit with him or help clear the building. I said, okay. So I went down and I sat with him for 20 minutes while we waited for law enforcement, who was a block away from us, to step in and support us. We were there for 20 minutes. I remember sitting in that room. It was dark. I didn't want to turn the light on because I thought it might trigger him. So I sat behind a desk. He was sitting on a beanbag less than 5 feet in front of me with a hoodie over his head and his hands in his pockets. And all I could think about for 20 minutes was what was going to happen to my kids if I didn't get to go home, because they are kids that had experienced foster care and they were vulnerable. And I should have been going home to them to help them. So fast forward to 2019, I was the associate executive director at a child welfare agency there. And it was late in the evening and we had a really rough day. One of our staff had been assaulted early in the evening, and we called law enforcement. Law enforcement was able to come and detain him, but he overtook 4 police officers in that process. He attempted to take their guns from them. He had them on the ground. They were wrestling with him. It took 4 of them to get him successfully handcuffed and into their car. This was all after he had assaulted one of our staff. So feeling a sense of relief that he had been arrested and law enforcement had custody of him, I went home, and I got a call later that night that Jayak had called our team and we needed to come pick him up. And I found myself in another situation where I was having to ask my team to do something that I would have never done myself. So I sent a team of 4 very young female social workers to pick this kid up. They didn't have guns. They didn't have zip ties. They didn't have handcuffs. They didn't have bars in the back of their cars. They themselves had to go pick this youth up and take him back into the office, where they then were tasked with contacting foster homes and residential placement facilities like Gina's and ask them to then take him into their care. We don't train our foster parents for this. And we also don't have the services and support. We don't have the resources and supports for our child welfare staff to manage some of the needs of these youth. So contrary to some of the things we've heard today, I don't believe that these are just isolated experiences. Some of the folks behind me were there with me and walked alongside me in this journey in some of these situations, but they too have stories of their own. And they too have had to make these types of choices and put people in really safety compromising positions. So thanks for your time and for allowing me to share.
Thank you, Crystal. Next up, I have Jeanette Owens with DECA.
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for allowing us to have time to speak today. My name is Jeanette Owens, and I'm the Chief Child Welfare Officer at DECA. We have child welfare programs, mental health, substance use programs, traffic safety, prevention, and research programs. I've worked the last 20 years in the child welfare programs at DECA. You've heard a lot of different testimony today from perspectives over how this has impacted our staff, our youth, our families. And today I'm going to share specifically my perspective from a family preservation viewpoint. DECA has family preservation contracts in both our Kansas City regions and our Wichita regions, and we are currently today serving 219 families. We work with all types of families in family preservation, and they all have a wide variety of needs. Our goal is to safely maintain those children in the homes with their families and to prevent foster care placements. In the recent years, though, as you've heard time and time again today, we've received a significant increasement in number of referrals for children with delinquent behaviors where the families don't feel like they can care for those kids adequately. We've received a significant increase in numbers of referrals for children where that risk of delinquency behavior is significantly higher than we had seen before. And unfortunately, the resources and partnerships for those increases haven't matched. 2 weeks ago, I set out with my staff to look at the number of youth and to get the data behind today. What does that look like? We asked each and every one of our staff members to review files and to look into the involvement with the juvenile justice system for the kids we are serving today. I have 31 youth in family preservation to date, as of today, where those needs don't match the available resources. We experience a variety of barriers for each of these 31 youth. The first barrier that I'll mention is just having the systems and increased collaboration between those overlaps and the needs there. Another barrier that we experience is just the gap in available services. You've heard it a few times today. We work with families with substance use consistently. We work with families with kids running away from homes. We work with families with gang activity. We have to have access to the appropriate interventions and resources to reduce the reoffending behaviors, to reduce the escalation in the behaviors. And again, not to repeat all before me, but another consistent barrier and probably the most concerning is the safety. Safety for the involvement of the youth themselves, safety for involvement of their family members, safety for the involvement of our communities and for our staff. One example that I'll share is a few weeks ago, I received an incident report that came across my desk, and I reached out to the staff and the director and the supervisor, and I said, is this kid safe? Is he at risk of harming himself? And I immediately received a flood of emails back of, oh, we're worried about. And it was a list of school personnel, the family members, because his behaviors included assault towards multiple people. Since that day, I have received 6 more incident reports with escalating of activities that this youth has done. The concerns and the barriers that brings for my staff, similar to what Crystal mentioned, I don't want to ask anybody to do something that we wouldn't do. And these staff know they can't protect those children the way that they want to. The last barrier that I'll speak about is our specific goal of family preservation is to keep these kids safe with their families. Despite our best efforts, and sometimes, sometimes parents become overwhelmed. They become frustrated because those resources and the services they need aren't there, and those behaviors are escalating. And this means those kids do experience foster care. And as you've heard, and as you'll hear in testimony most likely coming up, is then once they're in the system, it creates a whole nother set of barriers. We do experience success in serving some of these families within family preservation. And it's often when we can closely partner with juvenile justice providers, when we can have those community resources available, and when all of those things work together. We know that partnerships between systems and experts increase the opportunities and supports for successful outcomes. We urge you to identify ways to strengthen the collaboration and the resources across the systems. Thank you for your time today, and we appreciate your commitment to improving the lives of Kansas children.
Thanks, Jeanette. Okay, next up, Matt Stevens with St. Francis Ministries. Hi, Matt.
Chairs Kincannon and Owens, Vice Chairs Johnson and Smith, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today about the intersection between child welfare and the juvenile justice through the lens of St. Francis Ministries. For those of you not familiar with us, St. Francis Ministries is an independent, not-for-profit that has served Kansas children and families since 1945. As St. Francis, we remain committed to providing high-quality service to children and families that meet the current needs of Kansas families. Today, St. Francis provides a continuum of child welfare services that can be categorized into 3 areas: prevention, out-of-home, and residential. St. Francis cares for more than 2,950 children in foster care as the DCF case management grantee for catchment areas 1, 2, and 7. In addition, St. Francis sponsors more than 470 foster care homes, directs 2 youth residential programs, and serves children and parents with innovative and evidence-based mental health and substance use treatment services in Family First Prevention Services Act programs. To perform this work, St. Francis employs more than 975 Kansans across 18 offices in 66 counties. My name is Matt Stevens, and I serve as Vice President of Foster Care Homes. I'm joined today by our CEO, Bill Clark, and our VP of Permanency, Holly Dean Osborne. In preparation for today's meeting, much like Jeanette did, we went through our files to really try to categorize some of this information. And so I'm going to go over that with you. One of the things that we wanted to look at the 2 things we wanted to look at and talk about a little bit more today is what we define as crossover youth. So those are the youth that are currently in our service array that also have intersection with juvenile justice. And then also the moderate to high risk offenders. And those would be the referrals that we receive that really come to us. If you read it, it would come to us essentially because of a lot of their behaviors, as opposed to behaviors really predicated on their parents. So I've kind of given our definition of those. The crossover youth population, we currently, when this data was pulled, had 2,984 youth in foster care. 1,746 of them were 10 years and older. So again, we wanted to make sure we're capturing kind of an older group. That led us to 385 youth that we would identify as crossover, and that would be about 22%. And so a lot of the struggles with serving that population is that even when they are in the child welfare community, they still maintain behaviors such as defying caregivers, repeated truancy from schools, running away, alcohol and drug abuse, risky sexual behaviors, or other activities that threaten their well-being or safety. And that can include conflict such as theft, vandalism, physical or verbal aggressive, assaultive behaviors, and property damage, setting fires, etc. Very quickly, we also wanted to kind of look at just what an example of some of that would be. And so I pulled some examples. I'm only going to talk about one of them. And so you feel free, obviously, to read this later. But we had a 17-year-old that was being transported to their grandmother's house for the weekend visit. That 17-year-old did not want to go to grandma's. He got angry, lunged from the back seat into the front seat, began assaulting a staff that was driving a car and swerving the car. So for our referral data, so these are the children who would come to us, obviously, with already some juvenile justice interface. And so last calendar year, we had 1,706 children referred to us. 855 of them were over 10 years of age. And so 286 would have met that classification. And 33 that turns into 33.5% are coming to us with some juvenile justice information. And so again, I'm going to grab one of these examples. Feel free to read the rest or later. But we had a child who was referred to us after firing a gun at his sister. He had also hit her and was charged with attempted murder. He's currently on probation, and his parents are refusing to take him home. And so, as DEA Bennett and County Attorney Dalkey talked about, they're using child welfare as an alternative to, or kind of their only alternative to get these children kind of outside of their home. St. Francis also provides family-centered therapy kind of as an intensive in-home prevention service. And just so that you guys are aware, we've got 151 youth currently receiving those services. About 18.5% of those would meet those same classifications. So similar to what Jeanette was saying, we're seeing more and more of these children. This particular intervention, we're using another state very closely with their Department of Corrections, and we're seeing very good outcomes with children being able to remain in their homes. So what does this mean for the foster care system? So what are those challenges? And so foster care is a necessary intervention for vulnerable children determined to be an imminent or immediate threat if they remain in their current living situation. As such, services are tailored to provide healing to the family of origin, ensuring that that child remains safe. The child welfare system was never designed to work independently and relies heavily on other community-based services to support the goals of safety, permanency, and well-being. The child welfare system has always served high acuity youth. However, recent referrals and the behaviors of moderate to high-level juvenile offenders have created additional challenges in the child welfare system. Those challenges are predicated by the behaviors described above that would include threats and physical assaults of other children within the child welfare system, foster parents, and child welfare professionals. The impact of these threats and assaults upon the child welfare professionals is significant. Child welfare professionals are experiencing both primary and secondary trauma. Those experiences are contributing to long tenured professionals leaving this critical work. Those departures can directly impact how we're serving children who would be your typical child in need of care, someone who's experiencing abuse, neglect in their home, or whose parents are no longer able to care for them. Like other providers, we have sought to find creative solutions to this. So we have created an after-hours department comprised of about 45 FTEs. I'll tell you that is not enough to really manage these behaviors that occur kind of at all hours of the night. We have contracted with multiple attendant day programs. We have hired off-duty police officers as security in our local offices. And we've hired additional clinical staff to help serve youth with complex mental health and behavioral health needs. Our recommendations would be to require increased access to evidence-based prevention services that can be delivered collaboratively with community resources. Those collaborative service delivery will allow for the youth to be held accountable for their actions if they continue to put themselves or others in unsafe situations. And timely intervention is imperative in slowing escalating behaviors and demonstrating that there are consequences for actions. St. Francis Ministries also supports expanding placement access to best support high-risk juveniles. St. Francis Ministries remains committed to serving children and families in the state of Kansas. We're proud of the work and the partnerships that we've built over the last 45 years. And I am willing to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
All right, thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Linda Boss with KBC. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Linda Boss. I am president with KBC Kansas. And we understand this issue from a child welfare perspective, but within that, we are one of the 4 case management providers. So we understand it from a case management perspective. What does it mean to care for these youth and how good of a job are we doing? But we're also supporting 1 in 4 foster families in the state of Kansas. So we also understand it from the perspective of foster families who, as you've heard today, are receiving phone calls from our organization and others asking them to open their homes to these children, and they may be caring for other children at the same time. I hope if you've seen me testify before, you know that I love data and I love solutions. So I hope I will bring you both today in my short time. First of all, Senate Bill 367 was coming from a good place. I agree with what others have said. Children who grow up in congregate care always have poor health and life outcomes. We should never want any child, regardless of their family situation, their behavioral challenges, their mental health challenges, to grow up in congregate care, including detention. The outcomes will always be poor. The inadvertent impact on foster care. Well, the numbers, I should also point out that my testimony looks like this. It says we can and must do better for crossover youth. There's a graph at the top that shows as the number of children entering and being detained and growing up in detention has gone down, the number of children growing up in foster care has gone up. What I want you to know today is that we have just shifted the problem from one location to another. Children in foster care who have juvenile offending behaviors are growing up in congregate care in child welfare. And I would argue we're actually doing a worse job because, as you've heard today, child welfare was not prepared for the influx of these children. Our staff didn't get the right training. Foster homes didn't get the right training. We didn't have the right personnel. We still don't. I'm going to give you one example of the 200 youth that we're caring for at KBC that fall underneath the juvenile offender category, crossover youth. We have 1,400 kids in our care. We pulled the data. At any point in time, we have 200, about 14% that are a juvenile offender. I'm going to call him Kevin so I don't, so it's confidential. But Kevin came into care at 15 and a half, already as a registered sex offender for offending on 2 of his family members. He had safe and loving caregivers at home, but there was a court order that he could no longer live with anybody under the age of 16. So he came into foster care. The immediate challenge is most of our foster families have children in their home who are under 16. And it wasn't just live with 16, it was that no children would be over at the home. So even if we had grandparents who were foster parents whose grandchildren came over, this would not be an appropriate placement. So it's coming into foster care. He has been, by the end of this week, will be on his 20th placement, all of which have been congregate care settings. He has never completed the sexual offender treatment that he was supposed to complete after entering into out-of-home care. He's going to turn 18 in 2023. I would argue he's in a worse position in terms of preparedness for life and having addressed his own mental health challenges that resulted in him in perpetrating on family members in the first place. He's going to exit the foster care system, and we have completely failed him. I would have rather seen him stay in detention, and at least he would have received consistent services because he would have been in one location for an extended period of time. He still would have had poor outcomes, but we have to do better. Again, we had a youth with safe caregivers. The caregivers still to this day want him home, but there is a court order that says he cannot return to that home because of his sexual acting out behavior. Kevin is just one of the other 199 youth that are in care right now. And we are not talking about low-level behaviors. Child welfare has always had youth that have had misbehavior. When you are traumatized as a child, sometimes that comes out as externalizing behaviors, stealing, doing drugs, running away from home. Child welfare is equipped to manage that. I am talking about the youth who cannot be placed with younger youth that are already on a sexual offender registry, who routinely bring weapons into the office, who routinely assault other individuals, and who are growing up in congregate care. And not just one facility, they're blowing out of congregate care facility after congregate care facility, and we are not setting them up for adulthood. I agree, we do not want them in long-term treatment, but growing up in congregate care, but we need them to be able to access treatment, and we need to back this up. Families are having their children enter the out of foster care system because, as you heard today in testimony, They're scared of their own children. We missed an opportunity to intervene with those families much earlier at the first signs of mental health disorder, at the first signs of conduct disorder, the first signs of truancy. We have to back up and get in with families sooner. And when there is a challenge in that family and that youth is not safe, we have to wrap around them with the community services that were promised to these families when the detention center beds were closed. We have to open up other opportunities for these children and families to be served in their own communities, whether they're being moved from community to community in the foster care system that is also not set up to serve these youth well. I mentioned that about 11% statewide of all youth in foster care have juvenile offender behaviors. We're talking about 700 youth today who are in foster care, who are in foster homes or congregate care, that likely for the majority of them are not having their needs met to grow up to be a successful adult. My second graph on the first page, you'll also see that Kansas is unique in the percentage of children we're bringing into care that are adolescents. This is not what other states' graphs look like. So if you notice, the highest number of children entering care are babies, which makes sense. They're the least likely to be able to protect themselves. We should see after the age of 12, those bars continuing to decrease, but we don't. We see starting at age 13, they start to increase again. And at 15 is our second highest category of who's coming into foster care. We're not serving those children at home like we should be. We're using child in need of care to figure out what needs to happen next, and then we're missing an opportunity for those children to remain safe at home. I'm going to move on in the interest of time to recommended solutions. You've heard some great ones already today. I know that House Bill 2021 has been introduced to rectify some of the changes that need to happen with 367. I've highlighted a few of them there with the bullet points. We need systems to come together. Juvenile offender system, child in need of care system, the court system, to look at what services need to exist in our communities to better support these youth and to slow the process down. Right now, children are being removed from their house and put into foster care. And then the assessments and the services are trying to come together after the fact. That's not the way we need to be doing it. We need to slow things down and find out to those parents who are struggling to raise their children because they're scared of them. What services do you need in your community? And we need to make sure that those services exist in those communities, because in most counties, they do not exist in the right capacity, as you've heard earlier today. We need to be able to share data across systems. And we have half of those detention beds that were closed could be repurposed into respite beds, cooling centers. Many of the families that I speak with, they don't have any opportunity in their community to have their child go somewhere for a few hours or a few days while everyone cools off and come back together to re-engage with service providers. And by the time they get to child welfare, they are so overwhelmed and so hurt that they don't see any alternative besides foster care. If we had more respite, crisis beds, cooling beds in our communities, we could have more children staying at home, out of congregate care, out of detention, but being served the way that they're supposed to with those reinvestment dollars. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Linda. Okay, batting cleanup. We have Rachel Marsh with the Children's Alliance.
Good afternoon. I'm Rachel Marsh with the Children's Alliance of Kansas, and I know that I have less than 60 seconds. So what, what I will do is point you to the testimony that we wrote. We, as you have heard, are struggling with the population of youth. It's a relatively small population, but they have such intensive needs, and we haven't been meeting those needs. And the emotion that you're hearing behind us is providers who are so ready for help. We're ready for solutions. So I didn't spend my time talking about the concerns that we're seeing in my written testimony. I spent my time pointing out that there are solutions for this population. There's multi-systemic therapy that can be expanded. It's already in Kansas. We can grow it. There's functional family therapy that can be offered on the child welfare side and on the Department of Corrections side. We can expand the number of youth that the Department of Corrections can help through amendments to Senate Bill 367, and we can require the Department of Corrections to have residential facilities so that these youth do not have to go to 20 different congregate care settings, but can stay in one place. We have Oregon treatment models for therapeutic foster care for delinquent adolescents. There are model after model, and we are not using them in Kansas, and there is $40 million sitting there ready to be used. I would ask that you would help support getting those funds to the programs and services that work for this population, because nobody wants the outcomes that we're seeing. Thank you so much for your time and opportunity to present on this issue. And I'm happy to stand for questions.
Thanks, Rachel.
I didn't
Okay.
do 60 seconds.
Okay, it's after 3. If anybody needs to leave, just feel free to go, but we are going to take a few minutes here and take some questions. And my co-chair, you go right ahead, and Chair Owens, you can have the floor.
Thank you. I could probably take a whole nother hour with the questions that I have, but I'll limit some of my thoughts and comments. First, I just want to take note that on Monday, we're having the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee is presenting in the Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee over the status of the juvenile justice funds that were just mentioned. And so anybody that's interested in that can follow that meeting as we discuss that. The other point that I wanted to bring out is there was a few pieces of testimony over juvenile crisis intervention centers. Kind of what we were just talking about is a place where where these youth can be taken when there is a crisis. There is legislation that was introduced that we'll be working in our committee as well that deals with making sure those aren't too focused on mental health, but actually expanding it to behavioral health, which opens up a whole gamut. Currently, those funds have been sitting there for better than 6 years, and nobody has been able to access those funds to build juvenile crisis intervention centers. This is something that we're digging into because it's not for lack of want. So we're going to be digging into that with the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee as well. Finally, I had a question for Randy, only because I'm just curious to what extent does KDOC currently communicate with DCF as it relates to what we have seen since SB 367 passed, the decrease in the number of cases, but the increase in number of kids going into foster care. Do those communications occur? Are we aware of that? Are we working together to solve that? Or are these agencies simply looking to us to provide that direction?
Pretty complex question, believe it or not. I think just to communication, I think on an almost daily basis, there's probably communication between the central offices of Juvenile and DCF. They serve on committees together. They do a lot of things, but there's so much work going on. You may not always focus on a specific topic. Data sharing is a huge challenge. Even measuring, and I'm glad to hear some of my peers and colleagues bring some additional data to you to consider today. But think about how IT systems, we in the bill, there was some stuff about build an IT system, and there's another bill, build an IT system. We have to pause sometimes, go, okay, we have to come back to the legislature, ask for appropriations. We have to build a contract specs. We have to bid it. So I think our IT project just got launched in 2021, the first phase, and another phase is coming this summer. I can't speak for the court system, but I can go off my anecdotal recall of other hearings before the corrections and other committees. That system's being deployed slowly, because that's not a criticism, that's just IT. I'm not current on what child welfare computer systems look like, but I might imagine they too have had a need for resources and build technology. So that's a challenge to actually measure this. So I just sum all that complexity and other parts I did not touch on. Yes, I think communication happens regularly. It's what is the solution that really makes sense for this population? I heard a lot of fantastic testimonials and a lot of fantastic thoughts about a small population, and being able to concentrate on the small population when probably juvenile justice caseloads and child welfare caseloads are frankly too dang high for the resources that exist. So you got to do all that work, and you can't spend the dedicated time on the really complex issues because you're just chasing yourself so much.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Further questions? Representative Humphreys.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, chairs. So this would be for Ms. Meyer-Hummel. So my question is, you mentioned one of your recommendations is smaller community-based child welfare contracts. Do you mean with child placement agencies? Who are you talking about those contracts with?
So I'm talking about right now we have the 4 or 5 child welfare contracts.
Whatever.
Yes, the CMPs. So it would be my recommendation. Obviously, I don't have a say in this, but it'd be my recommendation that we look at making those smaller child welfare contracts across the state. I'll own this. We when I was the former secretary, we didn't have a lot of options, and so I think for our child welfare contractors, we just didn't have a lot of people coming to the table to want to do this work, and so I think part of the comment and part of the question is we have to make it a manageable workload for other people to want to come and do this work. And so what I'm saying is my suggestion is to look at it and say, if we broke it down and said, you'll cover these 20 counties or these 10 counties, is that an option? You know, would other people come to the table?
I'm not sure when we redo those contracts or those grants, I should say, but.
The governor's looking at it now, as I understand.
Okay, and just one other quick question for you. In your testimony, you said that DCF contracts with you for intensive in-home services with a 99% success rate. And my question is, you know, some of the issues we heard about, even from the attorney Remington Dalkey in Rice County, you know, what's a 100% success rate with a family that's not willing to? I mean, they're saying, yeah, we're doing everything. They're not willing to have accountability for their youth. Are you counting that as a 99% success rate? And what happens, you know, because we have family first, you know, and so we're trying to keep kids in the home, but what if the families aren't complying with that? How does that compare with your 99% success rate, and are they really doing it?
Sure, absolutely. I think one of the things different for instance, for us with the contracts we have with DCF versus like the family preservation contracts is when they contract with us, the families are saying, I want help, I need help. And they're willing to enter into that voluntarily. And so I think that's part of why they're so successful, is because when we do that contract work with the family knows and is asking for help, and we're able to work with them. And so I think that buys into success.
Just really quick. And that's not true with the family first, the family pres.
I think there's sometimes when families are voluntary, and then I think there's sometimes when it's highly suggested by the system that they need to participate.
Thank you.
Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my question would really be to your co-chair, if I can, for just a moment. Thank you. I'm having a problem understanding why it has taken 6 years for us to have money sitting there ready to work, and no one can explain why it hasn't happened. Now, I know in Johnson County, I think through the mental health, I was asked and several years ago if they had a building that was available and they were ready to go. And when I went to, they said it was about rules and regs. I went to the chairman of rules and regs. Well, they just haven't done it. If that's the excuse, that's on us. And that is pitiful, because we have kids out there that are suffering and parents that are paying. And they've had 6 years to get that done. And I think they deserve an answer on why it hasn't happened. Thank you.
And I couldn't agree more. That is something that we dive into. From what I understand, and this is again a question, and you're welcome to join us on Monday when we discuss this with the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, who is tasked with releasing those money, right? They're the one that's tasked with it. I've been working directly with Johnson County on that exact issue, because you're right, they had a building. They had community support. They were ready to go. And the reason that the first Juvenile Crisis Intervention Center did not come to fruition is because when they looked at the grant process and the difficulties accessing those funds through that association, through that organization, it was too big of a hurdle. And so our goal this year is to walk back and to find out what exactly is going on. And that's why they're coming to our committee. What's going on? Why can't these funds be accessed? Why don't we have juvenile crisis intervention centers in 4 different communities at a minimum at this point? I'm equally as frustrated with you as you are on that very topic. Not with you. Sorry. And that was my frustration coming out, because I feel the exact same way. And I feel that frustration. There's no reason that we don't have these. There's no reason we've been sitting on $44 million, because we all know what happens in this state when you're sitting on a fund of money. It gets swept to something else. And it was 2 years ago. And thankfully last year we swept it back. We've got to deploy it. That's our goal this year, is to deploy it.
Okay, I'll take one more question if there is one. Representative Butler.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think I'm the all of Florida down there. I didn't catch your name. I'm sorry, but you had mentioned that you had requested that one of the best things to do is to get all the different specialists together. Different, I don't know what all those groups would be to do it, and it would make sense that we would do something like that. I mean, if I go to the Mayo Clinic, it's that's the example they use there. They get all the specialists together. They work through until they come up with an issue. Is there just an issue getting people together to do it, or is it just something I've thought about?
To respond to RFPs that come out. If we're got, it feels a little bit like we play hot potato with these youth, and the end result is we're failing them. And so I think the real solution is all of these groups that are going to be involved in these families' lives getting together and looking at the resources, looking at the solutions, and putting a concrete timeline in place to be able to deliver those services to families.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for coming. This is a very informative hearing, and I appreciate, sorry we didn't have more time for questions, and I appreciate all of you for staying late. We're adjourned.